pleasure to introduce Ross Anderson from the University of Cambridge. I've known Ross for many years. We share a mutual interest in economics and security. When I tried to find a hotel to put him up a few weeks ago, I said, can he have his bagpipes in this room? Well, he can have his bagpipes as long as he doesn't play them. So today we're going to hear him speak on searching no evil. I totally came to the wrong place for that.
Right, thanks, Hal. When it transpired a couple of months ago that I was going to be here and Hal suggested that I give a tech talk, I just wondered what I should say that would be of interest here. So I've put together a few bits and pieces from various research threads. And one of the things that we do is a lot of empirical work, econometric work, if you like, on wickedness. We're into measuring spam. We're into knowing who's doing phishing and how. We're into looking for all sorts of scams. And this ties together, I think, rather nicely with some work that's been done over the last 10 years or so in traffic analysis and some more recent work on social networking. So firstly, let's just zip through traffic analysis. Back in World War II, this was really, really important because although we all know from the history books that occasionally German and Japanese ciphers got deciphered, it didn't always happen. But the reliable source of information, in fact, on both sides, was who was calling whom. You could recognize radio operators by their fist, by the way they did Morse code, and the other side could as well. So traffic analysis and traffic security suddenly became very important. They've been important for intelligence and law enforcement ever since. And in fact, if you look at the data, I don't know the US data offhand, but in the UK last year, we had something like 950,000 requests for traffic data, that is itemized phone bill data made by various law enforcement authorities, and only a few thousand requests for content. Why? Well, if you tap someone's phone and he's a bad guy, then usually what you get is, right, Fred, I'll see you in the usual place in 20 minutes, which isn't usually all that helpful. But if you know who he's phoning, and who he's texting and who's phoning him, and you can trace networks and you can do quite a lot. Now, we got interested in this a bit over 10 years ago in the context of the crypto wars. And more recently, in the last 7 or 8 years, as people have developed online anonymity systems, Tar, Mixmaster, Mixminion, and so on, we've done quite a lot of work in looking at traffic analysis, which becomes the big thread. And so we've developed quite a lot of tools. I'm not going to go into much of the mathematics of it. I'm sure an audience like this is well aware of Newman's work and things like that, because it's similar to stuff that you use in searching. But what I'm going to try and convince you of, if you aren't already convinced of it, is that traffic analysis is highly relevant for online services, especially as the bad guys get into the picture. The second thread, the security and economics thread that Hal and I started about 7 years ago, arose because we realized that many of the bad things that went wrong didn't go wrong for technical reasons, right? It wasn't because some idiot had used green encryption instead of red encryption. The real sources of failure were more often than not to do with incentives. One of the things that interested me was the fact that I studied a lot of electronic banking fraud, and I found that in the UK, banks were less liable for fraud. The liability rules let them dump liability on customers. In America, your banking industry is better regulated because your banks are smaller and more numerous and therefore less politically powerful. And so as banking consumers, you've got a pretty good deal here. So you would expect that there'd be more fraud in America than Britain. But it turns out it's the other way around, right? Because there's an adverse selection effect. Bankers in Britain, at least the guys in the middle of the organization who developed the systems, know that customer complaints won't be investigated seriously or at all, so they get lazy and careless. Something that Hal got interested in was why didn't antivirus companies sell as much product as they thought they should? Well, the answer was that from about 2000 or so, getting a virus wasn't all that bad a thing to have, right? 15 years ago, if you got a virus, it trashed your hard disk. But nowadays, it just uses your machine for sending out the occasional burst of spam or whatever. And in fact, most viruses nowadays are pretty sociable. You know, they will patch up your machine so that no other botnet recruits you. So there's a kind of equilibrium there, which results in the antivirus companies not making as much money as they hope to do. And then, of course, there's health security. One of the big drivers in America for encryption sales is HIPAA. Why did that come about? Because hospital IT systems are bought by medical directors rather than by patients. So they're very good at collecting billing information, and they're very good at collating clinical information for research, but the patient just wasn't at the table when the purchase was negotiated. And so you end up with all sorts of problems. And then, of course, there's the big problem everybody worries about. Why is Microsoft software so insecure despite its market dominance? Why doesn't Bill just say that, right, as of next Tuesday, JavaScript won't work anymore? Well, hey. Problems like these got us to start security economics. And now we've got a field with, I think, the last WISE, the last workshop on economics in InfoSec, had 140 attendees. So how does this touch on concerns here? Well, one of the best papers at WISE last year was by Ben Edelman on adverse selection and online trust certifications. So what's adverse selection? Well, Volvo drivers have more accidents than drivers of other cars. And why should this be the case? Well, there's two explanations. The first is that people who know they're lousy drivers buy Volvos, so they'll be less likely to be killed. Right? That's adverse selection. And the other is that people who drive Volvos drive faster because you've got a risk thermostat inside your brain, and you adjust the amount of risk to which you're exposing yourself to the level with which you're comfortable. Now, in my case, that's what happens, because when I drive the wife's Volvo, I drive it about 5 miles an hour faster than I drive my own Peugeot. So depending on the circumstance, it might be adverse selection or moral hazard. But here's our application of adverse selection. What Ben did was to go and get access to a database from one of the AV companies on which websites were wicked, in the sense that they hosted malware or did other bad things. And he looked at Trustee. Trustee is a certificate that you can get on your website. You go to the Trustee folks, you fill in a lot of questionnaires about your privacy policies and about how you're a good boy and all the rest of it, and they then let you use their logo in your website. So Ben started off by looking at that, and he came to the conclusion that websites that displayed the Trustee logo were twice as likely to be wicked as just random websites. And why should this be? Because wicked people go out of their way to sign up and get their seal of approval. He then went and looked at various search engines. And this is the scary thing, perhaps, for you, that the top Google ad, given some random commercial search string, is twice as likely as the top editorial search result to be malicious. It's not quite as scary as it seems, because if you go to a competing search engine just down the road, it's 3 or 4 times as likely to be malicious. And Google is in fact the least evil performer in this space. But it's still potentially scary, because a rational person here comes to the conclusion, don't click on ads. And so maybe something has to be done about that. One of the other things that was presented at WISE last year was some work that I did with my student Shishir Nagaraja on the interaction between game theory and social networking theory. Now, as I'm sure everybody is aware by now, many real-world networks can be modeled as scale-free networks. That is, networks where you've got a power law distribution of vertex order, and it's this tail which provides the connectivity. You've got a small number of people, if you like, with a very, very high degree of connectivity. And this explains all sorts of things: social contacts, disease spread, spread of computer viruses. And the highly connected nodes basically provide much of the connectivity in your network, but they also provide the vulnerability, in the sense that if you attack the high-order nodes, then the network can be disconnected very quickly. So here's an example of a positive use of this. In Sierra Leone, the HIV/AIDS program started off by treating prostitutes. Obviously, the high vertex order nodes and the disease transmission graph. And they've had a pretty good result, because only 2% of the population were infected, versus about 40% in Botswana, where people are very staid and respectable and unwilling to talk about sex in public, certainly not on the TV. Another example, if you conquer a country, you subvert or kill the bourgeoisie first. William the Conqueror in 1066, round up the Saxon landlords. Right, you, Godric, are going to marry a good French girl, or we're going to cut your head off. Right? Easy way to take over a country. If you've got the landowners under your control, the peasants don't matter. And then, in the case of an insurgency, you've got all these bad guys in terrorist networks, and some of them are badder than others because they've got fatter filofaxes. So the FBI goes out and arrests them and takes them to Guantanamo Bay. End of insurgency. Well, hey, the problem here is that you have to worry about the dynamic case. And the models that have been made up to now looked only at the static case, the one-off, you know, the invasion of England in 1066, the liquidation of the kulaks in the Ukraine in the 1930s, whatever. But what happens when the thing is ongoing? Well, we don't know how to get anything resembling an analytic solution of the kind of equations that you come up against. So we followed Axelrod's work on iterated prisoner's dilemma, and we did a whole bunch of simulations. The methodology here, evolutionary game theory, is to try and evolve one strategy against another. So you evolve a bunch of attack strategies and you find the best, and then you evolve a bunch of defense strategies and you find the best, and so on and so forth. So we set up a scale-free network of 400 nodes, and at each round, the attacker kills 10 nodes. And the attacker's strategy is his selection of the nodes. Then the defender goes and recruits 10 more, and he reconfigures the network. And how he does this is his strategy. And the limitation is that while the attacker has a global picture of the network, at least in this version of the work, the defender is supposed to use local knowledge only, which again mimics what's going on in an insurgency. And we iterate this for defense and attack. So what we found, first time round, is that the basic replenishment, whether you do it random or scale-free, doesn't get you very far. So you start evolving defense strategies. This black line is what we saw before. That's what happens if you simply replace the 10 nodes and then locally make things look scale-free by adding edges. What you might think of doing next is to replace the high-order nodes with rings. And this is what the first generation of peer-to-peer systems did. You know, pastry, card, ocean store, all these kind of systems. Rings have got properties that appeal to computer scientists. You can cut them anywhere and nothing's disconnected. You have to cut twice before you disconnect. Okay, so you think they'd be better. And they are for a while, but not much. Right? The network lasts for a dozen iterations instead of for 3 or 4. And what we then found is that if we used a strategy whereby high-order nodes were replaced with terrorist cells, if like small cliques, then that turns out to be almost completely resistant to a vertex order attack. So this gave us the first real insight into why it is, since at least the Catholic Protestant wars of the 16th century, insurgents have been organizing themselves into cells. We've actually got a model, and we've got code that you can download and play with. But this is just the starting point, because what we then look at are what are the strategies that you must use if you are up against bad guys who organize themselves into cells. Suppose you're the FBI, and you're trying to figure out some strategy whereby you can do data mining on this vast wodge of data that AT&T has so considerately given you of all the itemized phone bills in the USA for the past 50 years. How would you go about analyzing that in such a way as to find and to consistently keep on finding the important people in some conspiracy? Well, what we found on the back of the last lot of evolution is that centrality attacks, and in particular attacks based on betweenness centrality, are your best search strategy when your objective is node destruction and thus network disconnection. Now, what betweenness centrality is basically the proportion of all the paths across the network on which a particular node lies. So that's an order n cubed thing to compute, but there are approximate local measures that you can do fairly efficiently. And what we found is that the centrality-based attacks enable you, after a dozen rounds or so, to significantly reduce the size of the largest connected component. And that's the best result that we know of against the terror cell defense strategy. And of course, there are several evolutions beyond this. You can make attack and defense strategies more complex, and there's a bunch of papers on Shisha's website if you want to read up all the details. But that's enough theory, because when one's doing this economics business, the idea is you get some theory, some ideas that enable you to look for stuff, and then you go and collect some data. So I have another couple of research students, well, a postdoc and a research student, Richard Clayton and Tyler Moore, who put an awful lot of effort into the econometrics of wickedness, counting up various fish and spam and things like that. So I've put together a few slides which show some of our collection. I'm sure some of them will be familiar to you. I expect some won't be. In fact, if they were all familiar to you, then there'd be no point in coming here and giving this talk. So let's start off with the easy stuff. History of phishing. We've seen an evolution over the last 3 years. Phishing basically started in 2004. Last year in Britain, it was £35 million. America, maybe $200 million. And that's pretty impressive growth for a small business. Hey? Even by the standards of this part of the world. So people started off with obvious stuff. You'd have a misleading domain name. Or you'd have an insecure end user. This is somebody on some big web hosting service who's left himself exposed, and so the fishermen go in and they install themselves on a site that nobody's going to blacklist. You've got insecure machines, typically company machines that people manage to root. And then, of course, there are free web hosting services. So all the usual tricks that you would expect. But there's one gang that we've been involved in doing a lot of research on, which is different. This is the Rockfish Gang. And we believe that at present, these guys are doing about half of all the phishing in the UK and North America. So this is a pretty profitable business, and they've got some rather capable technical people there. They also seem to have some people who've maybe got a background in KGB communications intelligence, because they're pretty good at covering their tracks, and they don't do any of the usual stupid things that organizations like Al-Qaeda do, and as a result get their people caught. For a start, one of the reasons that phishing websites get taken down is the good old economic reason that they infringe somebody's trademark. And if you're trying to get an ISP to take something down, then DMCA is something that they understand an awful lot better than phishing. So if you say, I'm Barclays Bank, and you're hosting a Barclays with a CK, take it down, or you're a wicked person and off to jail with you, then the ISP takes it down, no questions asked. So the kind of style that you get with Rockfish, which is a giveaway, is something like this. They may have domains such as LOF80, and they then have unique URLs, which they can then use to direct the phishing victim through fast flux to one of a number of machines that's hosted on a botnet. So they've got the bank name in there. They've also got a unique nonce. There's the domain name. And since about February, they've been using this fast flux trick whereby the DNS server is serving up maybe 5 or 10 IP addresses at once, and then changes them to new ones after 20 minutes, and so on and so forth. And as a result, filtering this kind of thing on IP address just doesn't work. What the banking industry thinks they're doing about phishing is taking websites down. So the first thing that we did was to go and look and see whether this was true or not. And it turns out that it's not true, because we've got statistics here for a whole lot of different phishing scams, rockfish, non-rockfish. How long did a particular domain name stay in circulation? And as you can see, the means and the medians are quite far apart because there is a long tail. There's a rockfish IP address in Bolivia, I think it is, that's been there for about 3 months now. So the banks are basically getting these after 20, 30, 40 hours. But this isn't actually doing anything about the problem, because most of the response to a fisherman's spam run comes in the few hours after it. Now, you may get some trailing on for a day or so as people who've been away go and check out their email, but by and large, people are not anything like as good as they say they are at taking down these domains in time, and it's kind of not working. So we've got a number of statistics for taking down of free web hosting sites, and as you can see, there's quite a number of hours involved. Oh, and eBay gets an awful lot of this stuff. So there's phishing. Here's a number of other scams, which are potentially a big deal. Does anybody know what's going on here?
Information harvesting.
Well, you've got a job ad for an engineering manager for the Sydney Car Centre. And if you go on through the website, you'll see that they're also advertising for a regional assistant.
Money laundering.
And this is what they're actually after. They actually want to hire regional assistants. As for why? Primary responsibilities: be available to receive 2 to 3 payments on your bank account from the customers every week. Make a transaction via Western Union to the suppliers. Oh, and you get to keep 10%. That's how you get remunerated. Right, so this is Mule Recruitment. Sometimes used in money laundering. It's very, very widely used in phishing to find the people who receive the money from the phishing victims and then send it via Western Union to somewhere like Latvia, where Russian organized criminals go and collect the dollar bills. And of course, what happens then is that $20,000 arrives in your account. You go and send $18,000 via Western Union to Latvia. 10 days later, the little old lady whose $20,000 it was notices and complains, and it gets taken out of your account back into her account. You find that you're overdrawn by $18,000. You go to Western Union and you say, can I have my money back? And they say no. At least that's what happens to you in Britain and in America. In Germany, they put mules in jail as well, which some people think is unfair because the majority of mules who end up being recruited are elderly working class people who typically grew up in East Germany and are not really very with it, even with capitalism, let alone with the internet. So there's a significant amount of spam now is aimed at mule recruitment, and it's been climbing steadily in the past few months. This suggests to us that mule recruitment is now a serious bottleneck, and so it's an area on which enforcement action might well be targeted. Now, who's going to do the enforcement action? Because the big problem with crime on the internet is it's always somebody else's problem, right? You know, we had a wonderful example of this. We had a huge IT security conference in London back in the spring. The minister turns up and he says people should do more to protect themselves on the internet. And then he goes away. And the bankers come up and they say, the government should do more to protect us on the internet. And the antivirus companies come and they say, we're not going to be liable for anything, but you'd better buy our software or you won't be secure on the internet. And it went on like that all morning. It's always somebody else's problem. Now, who's got an incentive to stop these guys here? Well, not Sydney Car Centre, because it doesn't exist. Right? And more and more often, you're seeing non-existing companies. Why? Hey, so that nobody is going to be bothered and take a DMCA out against them and take them down. So the only people who are taking this kind of stuff down are the vigilantes. Is there a role for Google? Well, the longer-lived sites usually end up being indexed. So there's maybe something there. OK, here's another one. International Shipping Company. Anybody know what scam this is? Escrow scam. Quite right. We protect both the buyer and the seller with a simple 5-step trust process. It's a very simple 5-step trust process, right? You go to eBay and you buy this car, you know, second-hand E-Type Jag, only 70,000 miles on the clock, $20,000 and it's yours. So, yeah, right. So you say to the buyer, "Yeah, it's a deal. I'll pay it. How do we arrange it?" He says, "Well, I'm in Arizona, which is a long way away from you, which is why the car's still in good condition. Tell you what. Why don't we go to an escrow site and I'll give them the car shipping documents and you give them the money and they'll then swap over." And there is one business that does this as a respectable business, that's escrow.com. And there are about 198, give or take, bad people who are doing this as part of auction scams. Here, at least, there are the guys at escrow.com who are trying hard to take all these sites down. But hey. So, again, they're taken down by amateur vigilantes. And again, we're trying to track the speed of removal of these to find out what sort of contribution one gets from the financial institution's effort to generally clean this up, and it's not really very impressive.
Which financial institutions are interested in cleaning this up?
In the UK, there's Apex, makes a lot of noise about how it's taking down false sites, but the point is we don't really believe that any of these efforts are effective. So, one would tend to classify them as security theater. In fact, the bank's efforts to take down banking phishing websites are, as we saw earlier, largely in the category of security theater.
What about the efforts of the Vigilantes? What are they actually doing?
Well, the Vigilantes basically tend to be geeks with a sense of justice who go to ISPs and say this is an evil site, take it down, basically as a recreational hobby. We have one student who does this, for example. Well, we have a couple. And there's one of our research students, his mother got a solicitation coming from the Halifax Bank of Scotland, where the URL wasn't hboss.co.uk. So he duly called up HBoss's fraud team and said, is this a spam or a phish? And they said it's a phish. So, okay, thank you. So he phones up the ISP and says, this is an evil website, please take it down. It then turned out that it was, in fact, an HBoss bank marketing website, but it had been set up by another department using a contractor. And if you ever think of doing any work on security usability, just bear this in mind, that when one of the UK's top 4 banks cannot tell the difference between a spam and a phish, right? It's the security department can't tell its own spam from a phish and thinks it's a phish. Then what makes it trying to make my mother liable for this kind of stuff, hey? Okay, next scam. I'm sure you're very familiar with this kind of thing. So is this a good pharmacy or a bad pharmacy, and how do you tell the difference? Well, there are half a dozen highly reputable online Canadian pharmacies, and I'm sure you all wish that they're still trading when you get to the tender age of 65 and start being in the market for their services. But these guys are bad guys. They're flogging bad drugs or just taking your money. How do you tell? Well, we tracked a network of these sites down, and we found again, that once you've done a bit of homework, you can very often find search terms that will work. Because one person makes a whole bunch of different sites, or you've got a bunch of villains all copy each other's sites. So here, the search terms that turned out to work were blood pressure, cholesterol, and licensed by the College of Pharmacists of British Columbia, whatever that is. It seems to be a sure marker of wickedness. 23,700. I mean, that's almost a botnet, for goodness sake. Hey.
So how do you know they're bad?
Because we know who the good ones are. And here's another thing in the same.
How do you know that? I mean, how do you know that you know all of it?
Well, this is one of Tyler's rather than one of mine. And Tyler's American and understands these things. Look, my mum is a pharmacist, so my mum would have ways of finding out who is a licensed member of the Pharmaceutical Society. So I don't know offhand the answer to that, but if you look at Richard and Tyler's paper, they've got full details on this. Again, looking through the network of sites which do virility enhancements, you find, again, that there are large networks of sites that are basically plagiarizing each other. And the point here is that by looking at networks of plagiarized sites, you can very often pick up particular modus operandi and pick it up on an industrial scale and fairly quickly. 475 of this particular group. Okay, here's another scam. You know this scam, then. You know Hotshot Good. So what's going on here? Well, if you look at the price down there, you've got the Canon EOS 1DS Mark II for $1,880, which is a pretty good price, because if you go and look elsewhere, you find it costs about 3 times as much. So this is basically a fake shop. How do you know it's a fake shop? Yep. You know, we wrote a report on phishing for the Federal Reserve, which you can find on my website. And we came to the conclusion that the critical problem in phishing, as of 5 or 6 months ago when we wrote it, was extracting the money. And what the fishermen were then doing was using e-gold, because e-gold does irrevocable payments. So we wrote this report, sent it into the Fed, and before it was published, e-gold got raided and closed down. And that business is now going to Western Union and going to Mules. So at any one time, it seems there's some link in the chain that people use to see to it that payments are made that can't then be revoked. You see, if you just make a payment through a check or a credit card and a business turns out to be a bad one, then of course the banks will just take the money back. So irrevocable payments seem to be almost always a dead giveaway. What to do about that? Hey, that's hard. It's basically a financial industry regulatory problem, which is why the Fed is quite properly interested in it. Yep.
E-gold accounts were not anonymous. So how did it do the fisher good to receive the money through a non-anonymous account?
Right, this is a very common misconception. I'm glad you asked that question, because many people thought that the reason bad guys used e-gold was that e-gold was based in the Caribbean, therefore it must be anonymous, right? Sorry, the question was, how would people use, why would bad people use e-gold when e-gold wasn't anonymous? Right, the answer is that if you go back 3 years or so, e-gold was anonymous. It was based in the Caribbean after all. But then they had a run-in with the investigators of child porn, and they agreed that they were going to turn over records on production of proper warrants. So for the last 2.5 years or so of its trading life, e-gold wasn't anonymous, but the feature that it had, which appealed to these guys, was the fact that payments were irrevocable. Now, when you think about that, it's a very strange service to offer random people on the internet. Think about the last time you went and bought a car, right? The car dealer said he wanted a cashier's check. So you went to your bank, and it says $20,000 car. The bank might have charged you $150 for a cashier's check. Think about what's going on there. If you had paid the car dealer with an ordinary check for $20,000, then even if there had been plenty of money in your account, even if the check hadn't bounced, if it turned out 2 months later that the money in your account was stolen, that it had come from some kiting scam or whatever, the bank would have just reversed, and the car dealer would have woken up and found himself $20,000 poorer. So when you buy a cashier's check, you're purchasing for the car dealer insurance that that payment is irrevocable. Now, you would expect that in a properly functioning economic system, risks like that would be priced and would be transparent, so they would end up falling on the people best able to bear them, which is what happens with checks. It's the bank that's known you for the last 20 years, which can sell you a cashier's check much more cheaply than anybody else. What e-gold were basically doing was letting people buy cashier's checks for very much less, because they were relying on the offshore jurisdiction and the fact that nobody answered the telephone when somebody phoned up from an asset recovery department. Now they're gone. Western Union has taken the role, and there have been 1 or 2 other financial channels that have been used in the meanwhile, like banks in Finland for a while were very, very bad about helping asset recovery. But irrevocable payments are an absolute dead giveaway. Now, what you do about Western Union in regulatory terms is highly non-obvious. E-gold was a small business venture run by a few people, and the FBI could raid them and close them down. Western Union's a respectable US business that used to own telegraph companies and stuff.
But the question about e-gold was, how does it do the Fisher good to get irrevocable payment to a non-identity?
The question was, how does it do e-gold good to get an irrevocable payment to a known identity? And the answer is that once you go outside the highly documented parts of the world, known identity doesn't matter, right? So you get a bunch of people get phished in San Jose or Cambridge or wherever. Money gets swept into account. It would go through e-gold. It would then go into a bank account somewhere in Moscow or whatever, and guys would turn up with carpet bags and would take dollar bills. And whatever passport had been produced to open that account initially would have been forged, corruptly obtained, or whatever. So, you know, the assumptions that you make here about identity working basically don't hold in much of the world. In places like Nigeria, you can go and buy government-issue photo ID in any name of your choice from the local police for not much.
There are legitimate services which do take payment only by means like wire transfers or such, simply because the infrastructure in their country is not good enough to support the means of payments that we're used to.
Well, there's a long story here with Hawala and informal means of funds transfer. And one of the side effects of 9/11 is that the Hawala providers, who used to have a very efficient service for sending money to places like Pakistan and the Philippines, got done to death with red tape, reporting requirements, anti-terrorist funds transfer requirements, and so on, which, from the point of view of enforcement in ordinary commerce, had a highly negative effect. But if you go and read the paper that I wrote on non-banks and phishing, which is, I think, the second or third top paper on my website, you can get all the details on that. It would take us somewhat off topic to go and start discussing Hawala. But yeah, the near close down of informal payment, of traditional payment systems like that has led to a growth in the use of services like Western Union. Okay, so we were talking about Hot Shop Good, which appears to be a dodgy shop. If you search for Hot Shop Good, they've been around long enough that a careful person doing a check would see that they have turned up in places, Artists Against 419, for example, which lists bad people. So somebody doing due diligence on Hot Shop Good, who wasn't totally focused on buying his camera, might be warned by Google. So there's information there that might perhaps be used to do something useful. But traditional ways of using this information don't seem to work. One of the other things we're interested in is reputation systems. Here's McAfee's site advisor. Hotshopgood.com. We tested this site and didn't find any significant problems. Even there, if you had looked very carefully, you would have seen in the user reviews, 1 rating, bad shopping experience, user claiming they were robbed. Okay, and the guys who write this software, you know, think that the big green tick is consistent with the user claiming they were robbed. So there are interface issues and tagging issues and, you know, all sorts of interesting things here for engineers to get to grips with.
So, question about that. I mean, there's the obvious problem of how do you validate it? How do you know that, you know, this wasn't just some person who didn't like their product and they had it was basically user error. There wasn't actually any fault with the website. And of course, there's the UI issue of how do you represent that when most users can't get any more sophisticated than green, yellow, or red when they're online.
Well, indeed. And there's a question here about what sort of service a service company might want to offer here. A well-funded, well-staffed service organization might take the view that once you received a complaint that a user was robbed here, that somebody would take the trouble to go to the favorite search engine and have a look around and see what was going on. And someone who was a capable operator, who knew how this kind of industry works, could within a minute or two satisfy himself of the wickedness sufficient to remove the green tick and put in something in orange or perhaps even a nasty shade of red. How much can you automate? How do you bring in the experience of people who actually deal with this kind of stuff? What's the synthesis? For example, I don't know how it works in America, but in the UK, trading standards are a responsibility of local councils. So you've got all these people working for local councils who've been working there since, the 19th century, and his traditional job was merchants' weights and measures. So if you complained that you got short measure and petrol at Tesco's, they would go around with their van with a special petrol tank, and they'd buy a gallon of petrol and take the petrol away and weigh it, and if it was short, they would then run a prosecution. Well and good. These guys are kind of floundering in the digital age. What can the Bedfordshire County Council Weights and Measures Department do against scams like this? How do we reorganize the universe so that the money that governments, national and local, are prepared to put into consumer protection can be coordinated in some sensible way with the technology that's now coming to dominate business? Right? Because there is going to be some need for some human input into this. You can't make everything just algorithms. My thesis advisor, the late Roger Needham, had a saying that management is that which you cannot reduce to algorithms. If you can program it, it's administration. What's left is management. So there's going to be some management of, if you like, the consumer protection mission. Who's going to do it? Where is it going to be done? How is it going to be coordinated? Really, really big questions.
So do you think that the Vigilantes are the unrecognized county council, that a potential way forward is to recognize them?
The question was, are the Vigilantes the unrecognized county council that we can recognize and incorporate? And I suppose my answer to that is that when Sir Robert Peel set up the Metropolitan Police, the modern world's first police force, he took the view that the police are the citizenry and the citizenry is the police. A police officer is simply someone who is paid a salary to spend all his time paying attention to those things that are the duty of us all in any case. So, what do we have to say about dodgy shops? We find a number of structural similarities. Canadian pharmacies hosted on fast flux pools are obviously suspicious, and where you've got a suspicious pharmacy, you can then use plagiarism detection techniques to go and look for other similar suspicious pharmacies. Then with a relatively small amount of human effort, you can figure out what the distinguishing characteristics for suspicious pharmacies are this month. And Google can do some useful stuff here. It already is, but by no means everything. So there's work to be done there. Some more scams. Anybody know what this is? The nation-building-wide bank. We aspire to be one of the most admired financial services organizations in the world, recognized as an innovative, customer-focused company. Blah, 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 blah. Pardon me? Sorry, I didn't hear you. No, this is actually 419. This is a bogus bank. You know these emails that you get from the deceased, the widow of a deceased Nigerian dictator who's got $350 million, and it can all be yours if you will telex them $10,000 for a bribe. Okay, how do you go about reassuring people that the $350 million are actually in a bank account? Right, you set up a bank, which is easy nowadays. A bank's just a Perl script. Seriously. Some of them also have got vaults with gold in, but some of them don't. Hey. Being digital. Treasure Credit Bank, this guy. In a world of abundant global information flows, the TCB crew attempts to be selective and eclectic, in particular by focusing its '(S) services in areas where in-depth research and advice can really add values, such as smaller capitalized companies and property companies. TCB is a truly global institution. Yeah, great stuff. Fodder for the plagiarism detection mill. The firm is a business unit of ECB. You know, what are these guys on when they write this stuff? There's just so many giveaways. So, fake banks. That's another bunch of stuff. And again, nobody cares about them. Why? Because there isn't a proper treasure credit bank to put in a DMCA notice. And there's all sorts of stuff that you can use to pick these up once you've realized that they're a problem, and once you have got a sample, a training sample of a few hundred of them. You look at repeated phrases, you look at old links, stuff like that. And as I mentioned, these tend to be part of 419 scams. Next scam.
Pyramid scheme.
Pyramid scheme. Yes, Ponzi scheme. It's the old scheme whereby people come to your bank and you pay them 2% a day, 50% a week, whatever, and you pay the people who are already invested with you out of the money that comes from the new people. But the amazing thing that we've noticed over the past few months is that more and more of these pyramid schemes are completely upfront about it. People know it's a Ponzi scheme. It's like stock spam fraud. People know that this is wicked. They reckon if they put in $1,000 and they get out in the first week or two, they'll have turned $1,000 into $2,000 or $3,000, and it will be the suckers who come later who get screwed when the thing collapses. Okay? And never underestimate the gullibility of the public. Albania's economy was wrecked by a huge pyramid scheme that basically shrugged up the entire country's savings. And you know, anybody who didn't know that it was a scheme wasn't reading the papers. So you've got these postmodern schemes, as we call them, returns of quite a few % a day, double your money in 7 or 8 days or a week or whatever. And these are the only bad guys we see who can be bothered to pay for certificates, SSL certificates, just to show that you're a respectable Ponzi scheme. And you've heard of reputation sites? Well, you can find reputation sites which document all the various Ponzi schemes and their status. This one's still paying. Status paying, payout statistics, total return 298.50% in profit, rating 18.6 rate now, up to 25% weekly. Referral 10%. If you've got a neighbor you really don't like, so if you decide that you're going to get involved in a Ponzi scheme, there are places where you can go and, hey. Gmail is widely used by these guys. In fact, Gmail is very widely used by Rockfish and many of these guys. So, how many of them are there? Plenty. Botnet loads of them. Next scam, European Human Rights Centre. Anybody? This is one that I actually got because I chair a non-profit called the Foundation for Information Policy Research that looks at the interface between technology and policy. And these guys sent me an email, an innocuous-looking email saying, would we swap links? And so I looked at their site, and I was slightly suspicious about it, so I went and talked to Richard, and he dug away and found European Human Rights Centre, blah, 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 contribute to the general advancement of human rights research, blah, cooperation in Europe. Mission statement, building respect for human rights and the rule of law. Okay, feed that into the plagiarism detection system. And you find that there's another organization called Human Rights First, from which the European Human Rights Centre filched its text. Right? Plagiarism detection is useful stuff. So this is a respectable NGO. And what's the European Human Rights Centre doing? Well, they've got an awful lot of jobs. And they've got Google Ads. And they've got a lot of links from respectable NGOs who aren't just quite as suspicious as we were when they received that link exchange spam. Sorry?
How often do you see any of these scams using Google services? I mean, aside from the organic search results, how often do you see the ads by Google or Google-based or
I'll come on to that.
AdWords?
So you've got fake institutions. They send out spam to get links to the website. The thing is inherently respectable. It's handwritten spam. You know, people don't object to receiving it. Many respond to it. New graphics and layout, but stolen content. Many, many, many of these. Point of site is the job adverts. So basically, this is Google farming. And this particular set of sites appear to be owned by this chap, Nichifor Valentin, from Romania. Oh, all sorts of ads. Another example of one of his European Federation of Biophysics. This is as respectable as you can get, right? If you go and look at the behavioral economics literature, the people who are most trusted by the public are academics, right? The politicians are down there, then the journalists, then this, then academics are at the top. It's nice to know we get something. They certainly don't pay us. But of course, what's happening is now that our reputation is being stolen because more and more academic institutions are being forged as a front for job ads. Cambridge Journals Online, right? This is Cambridge University Press, was one of the people who fell for this lot and put in a link to the European Federation of Biophysics, right? And Cambridge University Press is as respectable as it gets. So when they point to the European Federation of Biophysics, your algorithms will be fooled for sure. Hey.
Sorry, this is very ignorant. Why do you want to make a front for job ads?
Because this nice chap known as Mr. Google pays you money to run them.
Oh, the Google ads, not the job ads.
Well, presumably they're making money from the job ads as well. Next. Scam. Anybody know what this scam is? Newsletter, computer security, illegal activity, internet security, viruses, and spam. So you have got some ads by Google, and you have got some articles on home and apartment wireless internet security. And there seems to be a certain disconnect, doesn't there? The ads are about busts in the sense of garden sculpture, and the content is busting wicked criminals on the internet. So that might be your starter for 10. So you see a site like this, you know that something a little bit fishy is going on. It's just a slight smell of salmon wafting on the breeze. So what do? Well, a couple of names there. Names are often useful to search on: Greg Kutsera and Paula Thornton. Let's see if we can find any more instances of them on the internet. TheAccidents.com. Car accident lawyers, lawsuit settlement, automobile insurance companies. So what's going on here? Privola Incorporated. Privola's business model is as follows. They buy up recently lapsed internet domains, to which there will, with luck, be still quite a few links extant. And they then hire a whole bunch of journalism students who need to go and write lots of tedious nonsense to put in their CVs so that they can hopefully learn to write and perhaps get a job one day. Privola internships are unpaid positions, and participants are responsible for arranging their own transportation and housing. Approximately 25 interns are chosen each spring, summer, and fall to participate in this unique program. And you know, these interns, they work really, really hard. You know, they get up one day and they have to write a magazine on busts, and the next day they have to write a magazine on car insurance, and you know, they roll up their sleeves and they get to it. The content is produced. It's not violating anybody's copyright. Hey, they're working for free. It's all respectable. And of course, what's the point of it all? The point of it is, of course, making revenue in form of checks from your good selves. Is this or is it not wicked? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because if any of you have got any experience of working in the pre-electronic publishing industry, well, there's plenty very, very tedious publications were set up to farm trade advertising revenue. So are these guys bad guys, or are they just slightly seedy entrepreneurs, or, what's the view that one would take of this? Does one have to take a view? But nonetheless, a troll, for networks of websites that appear to plagiarize each other, starts throwing up things like this as well. How do you go about deciding which is evil and which isn't? Okay, so there's a summary that you were asking for. Of the categories of wickedness that we had time to talk about today, phishing, fake escrow, dodgy merchants, fake banks, fake institutes, let's say marginal publishing companies. Some involve adverts, some are removed by motivated institutions, some by vigilantes. Some the vigilantes just don't pay attention to because they don't come across them. Vigilantes don't care about fake banks. Back-end mechanics of 419 scams are of no real interest to them. Self-similarity, you can see to a large extent. You get many of them by means of looking for plagiarism. Whether they're trying to hide, well, the phishing sites are trying to hide, but most of the others aren't. Many of the others are trying to get traffic and trying to get searched and indexed. Number of sites, well, this is dynamic. I suppose one thing you learn from this is that wherever there's a viable criminal business model, somebody will do it and build it. And once you build it, they will come. What can be done about it? Well, hey, there's going to be an arms race, I'm sure, over the next 10 or 20 or 100 years of measures and countermeasures and countermeasures. And if you're a company that's involved, like it or not, in this business, there's a whole bunch of, if you like, basic science that's relevant to the problem. Security economics, sure. Traffic analysis, sure. Community detection algorithms, sure. No doubt many other things as time goes on. What are we interested in? Well, I suppose this part of our security group is interested in how do we fix incentives to stop phishing being so effective? Right? We've seen a number of ways in which bad incentives allow the fishermen to get away with it. The banks do security theater, and few other people worry about the problem at all. Government simply hopes it would go away. Government wishes that people would take more care. They won't. And it's not going to happen. So are there algorithmic resources? Well, there are algorithms that you can use to detect reputation traders, that you can use to detect fake communities, and other covert things that are going on. And these should surely be not too far from your core competencies. Another interesting question is whether community reputation sites can make a long-term contribution. Who are the police going to be in the internet age? Are they going to be civil servants in Bedford Town Council who've got a log-on to some Google engine and who type in bad stuff that they found? Will it be networks of people who are volunteers? What's the split between the algorithms and the people, between the administration and the management, between the minds and the mathematics? It's easy to get that wrong. Another question is whether advertising is distorting the web. The answer is almost certainly. If you didn't have Google Ads, then you wouldn't have Privila running a publishing business. Will something useful come out of this in the long term? If you consider soap operas to be a form of art, and I'm sure there's some media studies professors would take that view, then clearly television advertising was a good thing because it enabled the creation of that art form. But hey, what are the online equivalents of this going to be? And finally, what other cool stuff is there at the boundary of technology and economics? Because many of the really interesting problems nowadays aren't pure tech problems, because if they were, somebody would have built something that would have fixed them. And they're not pure economics problems, because if they were, the economists, politicians would understand them and have worked out some kind of policy or law or whatever to do stuff about them. It's where these two worlds meet, and people don't share a common language, common assumptions, and common ideas about how you go about dealing with problems, that the interesting stuff more and more hides. And that's what we were interested in looking at. Now, I think that's it.